Okay. All right. So just to bring back, I know we went over this at the beginning of the semester, but I just want to give a refresher on Piaget's stage, and this is where, at least within Western culture, he argued that we go through this around the age of about 12, 7 to 12, called the concrete operational phase. In this, as he argued, we start to do what's called logical thinking, but we still can't do abstraction. Okay. So this includes the ability to do reversibility. Remember, in early childhood, children, according to Piaget, were not able to, for example, if they broke a toy, they didn't know or couldn't figure out how to put it back together. Okay. Where in this age group, we start to see that ability. Classification, the ability to organize objects into hierarchical conceptual categories. So putting things, um, apex predator down to predators that don't hurt, so he could think that, or from prey to um, being preyed on. Okay. Seriation is the ability to put objects in order of height, weight, or some other quality. Now, I want to focus though, because there's a reason why this is called the concrete operational phase. So while we're able to do these more complex mental tasks, to deal with this overwhelming world that they're living in, and they come out of early childhood. Remember, in early childhood, they on average can do 50 to 60,000 words. And this stage is about making all of that sensible into classification and seriation process. In doing so, as the um, uh, description up here denotes, that we're not able to abstract things. We think in a very concrete way. So there's good and evil, there's cops, there's robbers, there's black, there's white, and so on, because we're dealing with all these categories, and it gets a little bit too complex when you start thinking that the world is a gray area. So we want to make it very concrete. Okay. There are three areas that we know start to develop during this period, and we'll get to each one of these. But the first one is the attention. We're able to attend to things for a much longer period than when we were in early childhood. So you think about, being able to sit through, for example, a 60-minute lecture starts to develop during this period, or having the ability just to sit down and listen to music for an extended period of time, again, starts to occur during this period of development. We'll see with memory, as we start to be able to use past memories to understand our current situation now. And we're have that ability to kind of start that autobiographical memory system. And we'll get to some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks of this ability here in just a little bit. And then executive function. When we think of executive function, it's being able to control our impulses better. So this is where, again, when we look at this from a social neuroscience perspective, stimuli come into our brain, okay, but it's processed primarily by the limbic system, okay? And the limbic system, based on again, memories and emotions and all those kinds of things, prepare the individual to act, okay? So unconsciously, our body is already preparing to act, but then that information is sent up to the frontal prefrontal cortex, where then we can take what's called executive control over it and then send an inhibitory response to the limbic system saying, calm down, or let's do this, okay? And if you've been in one of my classes when I explained this before, the example I use, and may have used it in this class too, is when someone really ticks you off and you really want to hit them across the face or slap them really hard. If you notice, you're prepared to do that. So you might have the clenched fist, getting the sweaty palms. You feel the anger and the adrenaline start to flow through your body. But then executive control takes over and it says, no, this is a bad idea. We'll get in trouble, walk away, call them some names, I don't know. And we release our hands. Okay. That's called taking executive control over your behaviors. Okay. And as I mentioned in a lot of my classes, there is a type of human called a psychopath who doesn't have that inhibitory track that goes from the prefrontal cortex to the limbic system. And so one of the issues that psychopaths have is they are very impulsive and very much just want to use other people as an object rather than something that has some type of value. And so that's where the impulsiveness with psychopathology comes from. Okay. So let's talk about attention. If you remember, we talked about the myelination of the brain as we enter this period. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the processing speed of attention, but just keep that in mind that we start to be able to attend things and start to do what's called automatic thinking, okay? And the best way to kind of explain this, the automaticity, is, well, if we were talking about learning, and we talk about associative learning and learning based on reward and punishment, right? And one of the things that I always challenge students to do when doing a lecture on that is going to your car, make every decision you have to make in order to get in that car, starting with which hand you're going to use to grip the keys out of your pocket, which fingers are going to do the gripping, how are you going to pull it out of your pocket, and so on. And you'll find that just to get in your car, you make 600 decisions just to get in, put the seatbelt on, and turn the key. Okay. It is during this period of time and the development of attention and processing speed that we don't think about all those steps you have to do to actually get inside your vehicle. It just becomes automatic and you think it's one continuous behavior. But if we truly break it down, it's actually several hundred decisions you're making at that time. Okay. So during this period, our short-term memory, which is our brief temporary storage of information. In fact, this term is now called working memory, okay? Over here in this little print over here. I don't know why that's so small. But we know that our working memory starts to develop and we're able to work with more information at one time. And so this gets into things such as multitasking and the ability to work with multiple pieces of information to deal with a problem or some type of issue. This is also where we're kind of starting to make the decision about what memories you're going to keep and what memories you're going to throw out. Okay. And this happens when you're working with these different stimuli. So there's two basic ways that we get from short-term memory to long-term memory. One is grouping, and two is elaboration. Okay. Elaboration is really doing that deep thinking about your topic. And the more emotional it is, the more elaboration of emotions, the more likely it'll get into your long-term memory. Okay. Our knowledge base starts to increase as well. So our ability to retain knowledge beyond understanding how to operate within the world. Okay. And again, this one is that kind of direct relation between play in early childhood and later childhood abilities, as we find that the more play a child does in um, early childhood, the better a person is able to develop a larger knowledge base to deal with cognitive tasks, school tasks, even social tasks. Okay. Um, this is awesome when we start to develop false memories or memories of things that didn't actually happen. Okay. And I'll give an example of this, kind of going into more young adulthood and later adulthood. In kind of an example of how this occurs. Okay. Our current memories are not based upon the past. Our current memories of something is based on our emotions and our thoughts today. Okay. So let me give you an example. We've gotten into the digital age and everything, so everything gets recorded now, like birthdays and events and all kinds of things. Okay. And so um, we're able to ask people, what do you remember about, for example, your 12th birthday? Okay. And we found that depended on their mood, determine the things that they would remember. If they were in a happy mood, they would remember all the things that were happy. If it was in a bad mood, they kind of put a negative twist on the birthday. And we compare what they say to the actual videos and photographs, and we find that in some cases there's people missing. In some cases, there's people that weren't there that all of a sudden are appearing into the memory system. And we found that this putting people in and taking people out of a memory has a lot to do with your emotions today. So if you were in a negative mode, negative state, you might add some people into that birthday that you don't have a lot of good memories in the first place with, even though that person is not actually there. Okay. The other things that are highlighted in this period, and I already kind of talked about the working memory that are in when I talked about the short-term memory, but two things are cognitive flexibility, and this is ability to switch focus as needed from task to task, and inhibitory control, that ability to stop that automatic processing and put something on. And this is often seen with what's called the Stroop test. Okay. So if you could imagine, here's a red E, okay, kind of, if you can use your imagination, that's supposedly an E. Or here I'll try and do a small E so that we know that it's an E. Okay. Now let's say that again, I'm cognitively loading you. And when we say cognitive loading, it means I might have you do some math problems. I might have you read a complex poem. And then I stop you and I said, um, actually, this is not a good example. Um, let's use, I just messed this up. Okay. Let's use the word blue. Okay. There we go. I forgot they have to be reversed. So in this cognitive load thing, I asked them to say, what color does that word say? okay? The higher your cognitive load, you're more likely to say red than blue, okay? Because that's the word I asked for, okay? And so we find that later and later in childhood, individuals become better at identifying the word instead of the color. The only time that this is not that we see less improvement is what I should say, is when we do that cognitive loading of the individual. So crossed age groups, the more cognitive load, the more mistakes that are made. But when you just allow a person to think about the question you're asking, you're more likely to say blue, whereas in early childhood, you're more likely to say red. Okay. Talking about language, as again I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, that language starts to get more complex and individuals start to be able to put words together to express meaning. Okay. So, for example, in a meta-linguistic ability is the ability to think about and talk about language. Okay. So, for example, I like the sounds of the words Brussels sprouts even though I don't like to eat them. Okay. Here you have two contradictions, the like of the sound, but the fact that you just don't like to eat them. Okay. Again, when we talk about early childhood, these contradictions can't be put into the same meaning. So if you ask someone in early childhood, do you like Brussels sprouts? They'll simply say either I like to eat them or I like the sound of them. But combining these two ideas that are contradictory become very difficult. Okay. And one of the things that we do note is if you have someone in middle to late childhood, they like to make their own jokes. And so they start to develop this idea of how do I state something to make someone else get humor out of it or fun out of it. And again, we start to see this in later childhood. Okay. Reading and how to learn to read. Um, again, it's kind of an interesting process because in the beginning, we do it through phonics. Okay, we come to understand that, for example, in some contexts, PH makes a f sound. But you'll note that in especially going from early childhood to late childhood, uh, children might use an F instead of a PH because f is also a sound that an F makes. Okay. So we go through that phonic stage and then we go to what's called whole language instruction. Okay. Where we start to then see the complexity of human language. So, for example, let's say, um, well, I remember when we were talking about early childhood, the difference between the word jeans as a pair of pants or genes as the kind of roadmap to your biological processes. Okay. And that we start to understand that there can be two words that sound the same, but are spelled different and have a different meaning. Okay, and this is when that ability starts to develop. And balanced reading approach. Okay, so during this period is when we start to develop what speed and ability we're going to be able to read at. Okay. And some of the things that we do know about writing skills, so that was reading skills, is developing automaticity of spelling. Okay. Develop things like composition, knowledge telling, knowledge transforming. So knowledge telling is sharing information with little or no evidence of planning or organization of ideas. Okay. So this is kind of like storytelling, whereas knowledge transforming is the goal is to convey a deeper understanding of a subject by taking information and transforming it into ideas that can be shared with a reader. So this basically means we start to develop the ability to create deeper meaning than maybe what we learned before. Okay. And knowledge telling is the ability to start telling stories that maybe they didn't even think about in the past or didn't have any experience with in the past. Okay. So this is also where we start to develop things like in where our intelligence and how we start to kind of um, be academically inclined, I guess is the best way to put it. Um, the definition of those qualities that help adapt successful to achieve our goals in life. And the thing that I want to everyone to understand at this point is at this period in time, we have what's called academic intelligence. And that's the intelligence that you probably heard about throughout your lifespan. Okay. But there's other kinds of intelligence that help us adapt to the world. So, for example, there's something called emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is your ability to reflect on yourself and reflect on others' emotional states and be able to interact with each other appropriately. There's things called, even some have argued that there's a creativity intelligence, and even to some lengths, street smarts intelligence. So I just want to point out at this point is really kind of in this beginning of this conversation, what we're talking about is that kind of academic type of intelligence. Okay. And we basically have two types of intelligence. We have what's called fluid intelligence, which basically allows us to quickly and effectively solve novel problems, okay? With even if we don't have a lot of training, it's the ability to transform knowledge. It's the ability to say, well, I believe this at this point, but now I have all this new evidence, so now I'm going to define it this way, okay? Crystallized intelligence is fixed information that it becomes harder and harder to change and redefine. Okay. So what we should note at this point is at this point in childhood, fluid intelligence is going to go up. Okay. So if we look at late childhood and we look at fluid intelligence, up until about the age of 45. Whoops, man, I'm not doing this very well today. Fluid intelligence here, I'll do a different color to emphasize this point. So fluid is represented by green, okay? And as we go to 45, our fluid intelligence gets good, but then our fluid intelligence starts to go down. Okay. Whereas with crystallized intelligence, we'll represent that with red, is it's kind of low, but then around the age of 45, it goes up. Okay. Um, and so some examples of this is about after the age of 45 is when we're not able to change our political views. No matter what our candidates do, we have such crystallized intelligence about what it means to be, for example, Republican or Democrat. We will stay that way because of the crystallized knowledge. People who have a strong religious belief, tend to crystallize that belief system and is unable to kind of change it as you move along. If you've ever argued with your grandparents, you probably understand this because they have a very fixed kind of, this is how the world operates, and we're not going to change it. Okay. Whereas before the age of 45, we were able to change our values, our ideas, our knowledge based on new information. Now, with that being said, I just want to remind everybody there is always variability in this. Okay. So instead of looking at them as direct straight lines, look at them more like a variable, that everyone will be slightly different on this. So there will be a few people who can maintain their fluid intelligence and inhibit more crystallized. Conversely, there are a few people who start with more crystallized knowledge and less fluid intelligence. So, and there's some personality factors that go into that, such as openness versus closedness and all those kinds of things, but we won't kind of get into that today. So just wanted to bring these two up while we're talking about development. So when we look at the development of intelligence tests, the person that's probably most known for it is Alfred Binet. He developed the test to identify students who need alternative teaching strategies. Okay. And basically what he did is he created tests based upon where a child is. And so he took a lot of samples and established what their mental age will be. Okay. And then to come up with the IQ, or what's called the intelligence quotient, he took their mental age, how they performed on a mental task, and divided it by their chronological age and multiplied it by 100. Okay. And then after that, there was some more tests done. And what basically happened is it created what's called a normal curve. Okay. So the average IQ is 100. Okay. And then it deviates by 15. And what this does is it lets us know that basically 68% of our population is between let's do the math here, 85 to 115. Okay. And then below that, we get to 95% of our population that are between 85 and 70. Okay. And then anyone beyond this, there's 2.5% over here and 2.5% over here. Okay. All right. And this is where a lot of tests are done to determine things like developmental disorders and stuff. Because theoretically, they say, anyone below 70 is considered having developmental issues. But then, let me get to this really quick. But then people are interested in, well, what about those who have an IQ above 130, which would be this population here? Okay. Are they somehow superior? Are they somehow better off than the people who have developmental delays? And so what I believe it was Alfred Binet actually followed kids doing a longitudinal study, followed individuals who had high IQs versus average IQs. And he predicted that it would be the high IQ peoples that became our attorneys, our judges, our governmental leaders, our presidents, and those kinds of things, where the people at 100 will be kind of those average type people. Okay. But he was wrong. All right. The most successful people are between 85 to 115 IQ. Those are the individuals. And the reason is because they're not so overwhelmed by their world and they're able to be social. All right. He actually found, and this is not an offense to these career paths in any way. He found that people with an IQ over 130 had very mundane jobs. They worked in factories. Some of them became garbage individuals collecting garbage. Some of them became store clerks. But very, very few actually ended up being very successful. And usually they were no more successful than the people with an IQ between 85 and 115. So, and then I think we'll have this conversation. Okay, I'll end with this thought here, and actually I should go over this. There are different types of theories of intelligence. So this one, if you want to take a look at it in the Canvas page, suggests that there are multiple types of intelligence. And others argue that we have these types, and I mentioned this earlier, that we have an analytical, which is something that usually is measured by an intelligence test, creative intelligence, which is generate ideas and deal with successful novel things, and practical intelligence, which are being able to solve problems by changing yourself or your behaviors. I think the thing that I want to talk about, though, as far as intelligence, is there's been an argument, is intelligent innate, meaning that is it genetically bound? Do our genes determine how intelligent we are? And this is what we call a fixed mindset. Okay. Or is intelligence malleable? Can we change our intelligence level? Are we maybe more intelligent than we think we are? And so in this context, I'm going to bring up two examples. One is going to college, okay? This study took individuals who entered their college years at an IQ of about an average of 90. And then they measured it again after that person graduated from college, and they found that there's a 15-point increase in intelligence, okay, or at least analytical intelligence. So theoretically, if you entered college at an IQ of 100, you're going to leave college with an IQ of 115, theoretically, okay? The other issue with intelligence is it's bound by our social situation. It's bound by our stereotypes about who we are, okay? And I'm going to bring up two research examples in this area. The first one is if we take individuals who do, so what we're going to do first is we're going to use what's called an analogy test. And these analogy tests are very much associated or correlated with analytical intelligence, okay? Where you read these analogies and then you have to solve them on some logical, using the rules of logic and all of those kinds of things, okay? So we have one group, and all of the individuals took intelligence tests before, and they all scored at around 85, 90, that range, because they wanted to, I shouldn't say they wanted to use individuals who have lower IQs compared to a control group. Okay. The control group took an analogy test where the writing was just how it's presented in maybe like this or Times New Roman. It was very easy to read. The other group, which we'll call the experimental group, read the same analogy test, but it was done in one of those weird fonts, okay? And they found that individuals who had to use the difficult one, their IQs increased by 10 points. So if the person was at a 90, their test score was 100. Now that shouldn't happen if intelligence isn't malleable, okay, or a change mindset, okay. But what we found is the difference between those two groups is the people who had to read the difficult one, where we saw increases in intelligence levels. They had to really focus on what was being said because the font was so difficult to read. They tended to need to look at it closer, analyze it closer, which suggests that usually our basic intelligence level is based on we just want to automatically process things and get through the world, right? And so we do that instead of really doing deep processing of these issues. The other one, and if you've taken my Psych 101 class, you might remember this, deals with stereotyping, okay? I'm going to draw two graphs to show this. Okay, and then, okay. Now, again, the stereotype of inner city Black young men is that they're less intelligent than individuals who attend Stanford University and the like, okay? But so we wanted to do, this was a test. This S represents Stanford, okay? What these researchers wanted to do is know whether or not intelligence or the ability to use intelligence is based on stereotypes that people have, okay? So let's imagine in this research, they had 2 Saturdays. Now, they measured the Stanford students, and of course, they measured pretty good, right? As you would expect. But they chose a Saturday because no one is usually around at the campus, okay? But on Saturday 1, the group that went to Saturday 1, there were some white individuals that were just there. They didn't interact with them. They were just present, okay? And on these tests of intelligence, the Black students who were taken from community colleges in the inner city measured kind of what you stereotypically would expect, okay? But on a second Saturday, students who were randomly selected for that, there were no white students. In fact, even the test administrator was a Black gentleman, okay? And on this second Saturday, the Black inner city communities college students measured just as high as the Stanford students, meaning they broke the stereotype when they don't have the stereotype there and present, and they're not reminded of what's called stereotype threat, where we even do self-stereotyping when we recognize somebody who is threatening or who is looks like being judged, okay? But when we're in an environment where we don't feel judged, we have the potential to be just as intelligent and just as smart as those individuals that have the stereotype of that ability, okay? So that's something that I'd like everyone to consider, especially when it comes to stereotyping, when it comes to deep processing, is really people are more intelligent than they give themselves credit for. That when we really sit down and deep process something, we can actually increase our abilities in this. When we don't allow ourselves to be stereotyped, especially if we have a very negative stereotype, then we can perform just as good as individuals who are expected to do well in intelligence tests. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop here for today. Maybe. I'm going to stop sharing.